Which ancient mystery do you think we'll never solve? Story 1. The Phaistos Disc is a fired clay disc, approximately 16 centimeters in diameter, discovered in 1908 in the Minoan Palace of Phaistos on the island of Crete, and dated to around 1700–1600 BCE. Both sides are covered in a spiral sequence of stamped symbols, pressed into the clay with individual seals before firing, making the Phaistos disc the earliest known example of movable type in human history, arranged in groups separated by dividing lines. There are 241 individual symbols in total, representing 45 distinct signs. Nobody can read it, not a word of it. Not a single symbol has been confirmed to represent a known sound, concept, or word in any attested language. More than a century of academic investigation, involving some of the most sophisticated linguistic and cryptographic analysis available to modern scholarship, has produced no consensus decipherment. The 45 symbol inventory is the specific number that creates the primary analytical headache. That's too many symbols for an alphabet, which typically uses 20–30 characters, and too few for a logographic system like Egyptian hieroglyphics, which uses hundreds. It's consistent with a syllabary, a writing system where each symbol represents a syllable, but what language uses a syllabary with these specific symbols is completely unknown. The disc is unique. No other object with these symbols has ever been found, which means there's no bilingual parallel text, no related corpus, no comparative material. Every decipherment attempt has faced the same wall, without a known language to match the symbols against, and with only 241 tokens to analyze. The statistical basis for any proposed reading is too thin to distinguish a correct interpretation from an elaborate coincidence. The disc sits in the Heraclean Archaeological Museum in Crete. People walk past it every day. Nobody knows what it says. Story 2. Rongorongo is a system of glyphs found on wooden tablets from Easter Island, Rapa Nui, discovered by a Catholic missionary in 1864, who noticed the islanders had boards covered in strange carved symbols and asked about them. The elders told him the glyphs were writing, that they could read them, that the knowledge of reading them was very old. Within a decade, those elders were dead, casualties of the devastation of Rapa Nui's population through raids, enslavement, and introduced disease, and every living person who had known how to read Rongorongo was gone. What remained were the tablets themselves and an extraordinary writing convention. The system uses what's called reverse boustrophodon. You read a line left to right, then physically rotate the tablet 180 degrees and read the next line. Again, left to right, then rotate again. The text turns the reader in circles, each line oriented oppositely to the one before. The glyphs themselves alternating between upright and inverted, depending on the line's direction. This unusual reading method was documented by the survivors before the last readers died, which is one of the few things we know for certain about how Rongorongo worked. What we don't know is what language it encodes, whether it represents a true writing system or a mnemonic device, and what any individual glyph means. Approximately 25 objects with Rongorongo inscriptions survive in museums around the world. The total number of glyph tokens across all objects is approximately 14,000. Linguists and cryptographers have studied them for 160 years. The specific and complete knowledge of how to read them died on Rapa Nui in the 1870s, and nothing in the scholarly analysis since has convincingly reconstructed what left with those elders. Story 3. The Voynich manuscript is a hand-written, illustrated codex carbon dated to approximately 1404–1438, filled with text in an unknown script, illustrations of plants that don't correspond to any identified species, astronomical diagrams, human figures in pools connected by anatomical tubes, and section after section of content whose purpose and meaning remain completely unknown. The world's most sophisticated cryptographic analysis, statistical linguistics, machine learning, and 6 centuries of human scholarship have not produced a confirmed decipherment of a single word. The statistical properties of the text are what make it simultaneously compelling and baffling. The letter and word frequency distributions follow patterns consistent with a natural language. Zipf's law holds. Word lengths are distributed the way they are in real languages. There are internal repetitions and regularities that suggest grammar. This means it almost certainly isn't random noise, and probably isn't a simple substitution cipher of a known language. It behaves like a language. Nobody knows which one. The illustrations compound the mystery. The plant section contains drawings of hundreds of plants, none of which have been definitively identified as any known species. Whether these are real plants poorly rendered, invented plants in a fictional botanical system, symbolic representations with no biological referent, or stylist plants whose connection to real species has been lost, nobody can determine. The zodiac section contains astronomical diagrams. The bathing section contains figures in liquid. None of it has been explained. The manuscript is held at Yale's Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library. It has been studied more intensively than almost any other undeciphered text in history. The gap between how thoroughly it has been studied and how little is understood remains one of the most humbling facts about the limits of modern scholarship. Story 4: The Plain of Jars. Thousands of ancient stone containers, with no clear purpose, scattered across the Sheng Kuang Plateau in Laos, are thousands of large stone jars, cylindrical, carved from sandstone, limestone, and granite, ranging from less than a meter to more than 3 meters in height, some weighing several tons, distributed across at least 90 separate sites and clusters that don't follow any obvious pattern of settlement, road, or resource. They've been there for roughly 2,500 years. Nobody knows what they were for. The leading hypothesis for most of the 20th century was that the jars served a funerary purpose, that they were used to hold cremated remains or as ossuaries before final interment, consistent with the bone fragments, glass beads, and ceramic objects found in and around some of them during excavations. This is still the most widely cited interpretation in archaeological literature. The problem is the scale and distribution. If these were funerary urns for a single culture's dead, the logistical organization required to quarry, carve, and transport thousands of multi-ton stone containers across a mountainous landscape and distribute them across 90 sites would be extraordinary. The population we're attributing this effort to was prehistoric, pre-literate, and has left almost no other trace of the organizational capacity the jar sites imply. Alternative theories that have been seriously proposed include storage for food, water, or trade goods, ritual use unconnected to burial, or some combination of purposes that changed over the centuries of the culture's existence. The region was so heavily bombed during the Vietnam War that large portions of the sites were rendered unsafe for archaeological work for decades, and the ground still contains unexploded ordnance that limits what can be excavated. The jars sit on a bombed plateau, mostly unexcavated, mostly unexplained. Story 5: Roman dodecahedrons, an object that appears across the empire and is never once mentioned in any Roman text. More than 100 small bronze or stone objects have been found across former Roman territory. In France, Germany, Switzerland, Britain, Hungary, and elsewhere, each sharing the same basic form: 12 pentagonal faces, hollow interior, circular holes of varying sizes on each face, and small knobs at each of the 12 corners. They range from about 4 to 11 centimeters across. They're called Roman dodecahedrons. Nobody knows what they were for. The specific mystery here isn't merely that we don't understand them. It's that we don't understand them despite the Romans being one of the most thoroughly documented civilizations in history. The Romans wrote about almost everything: military strategy, agricultural practice, architecture, medicine, philosophy, rhetoric, personal correspondence, tax collection, gladiatorial combat, religious ritual. Not one text mentions these objects. Not one inscription identifies their function. Not one artistic depiction shows them in use. For an object found across such a wide geographic range, spanning several centuries of Roman occupation, the silence is extraordinary. Theories proposed and subsequently disputed include surveying instruments, candle holders, game pieces, objects for measuring artillery shot sizes, knitting tools for producing gloves with fingers of varying widths, astronomical instruments for determining planting dates, or religious objects of some unknown cult. None of these explanations has been confirmed. Experimental archaeology has shown that some proposed uses are technically feasible. You can knit using a dodecahedron, but technical feasibility doesn't establish historical use. The distribution of find spots is itself puzzling. They cluster in the northern provinces of the empire, particularly Gaul and Germania, and are almost entirely absent from Italy, Spain, North Africa, and the eastern Mediterranean, suggesting regional rather than empire-wide use, which constrains but doesn't resolve the question of purpose. Story 6, the stone spheres of Costa Rica. Perfect spheres, up to 15 tanis, made by nobody we can name between roughly 600 and 1400 C. A pre-Columbian culture in what is now Costa Rica's Diques Delta region produced hundreds of near-perfect stone spheres, some the size of a grapefruit, some taller than a person, some weighing up to 16 tanis, from gabbro, a dense, crystalline rock quarried from mountains up to 50 kilometers from where the spheres were eventually placed. The culture that made them left no writing, no clearly identifiable structures beyond burial mounds, and no descendants who retained specific knowledge of why the spheres were made or what they meant. The technical achievement represented by the spheres is genuinely remarkable. The largest examples are accurate to within a few centimeters of perfect spherical geometry, an accuracy that, without metal tools, requires either a level of geometric knowledge and patient craftsmanship difficult to attribute to the archaeological record of the culture, or a technique whose specific method has been lost entirely. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that some approaches using stone tools and abrasion are feasible, but not at the scale of the largest spheres. Spanish colonizers encountered the spheres in the 16th century, and some indigenous accounts attributed them to a god or supernatural power, which may reflect genuine cultural memory, or may reflect the Spanish missionaries' tendency to interpret any unusual indigenous object as connected to devil worship. The accounts are too contaminated by colonial circumstances to be reliable as oral history. Many of the original spheres were destroyed or displaced during the banana plantation era of the early 20th century, when workers dynamited some in search of gold supposedly hidden inside, and moved many others as garden ornaments, severing them from their archaeological context. The UNESCO World Heritage Site, now protecting the remaining spheres in situ, cannot tell us what we've already lost in the objects that were moved. Story 7, Egypt's Lost Labyrinth. Herodotus described 3,000 rooms. Nobody has found them. Herodotus visited Egypt around 450 BC and described a structure near Lake Moeris that he claimed surpassed even the pyramids in his estimation. A building he called the Labyrinth, containing 3,000 rooms arranged across 2 levels, half above ground and half below. The underground portion entirely inaccessible because it contained the tombs of kings and sacred crocodiles. He was permitted to see only the upper level, which he described as so vast and interconnected that a visitor entering without a guide would never find their way out. Herodotus was not the only ancient writer to describe this structure. Diodorus Siculus, Strabo, and Pliny the Elder all mention a comparable building in the same region, all of them writing independently. The convergence of multiple ancient sources describing the same extraordinary structure in the same location, with broadly consistent details, is not easily dismissed as a single traveler's exaggeration. The problem is that nothing matching this description has been found. The site at Hawara, near the Fayum Oasis, is where most scholars place the labyrinth based on ancient geographic references, and it's the site of the pyramid of Pharaoh Amenemhat III, suggesting a royal complex connection. Belgian archaeologist Louis de Cormenin excavated at Hawara in 2008 using ground-penetrating radar and identified a massive rectangular structure beneath the desert surface at roughly the right location and scale. The radar anomaly is consistent with an enormous buried stone structure, but the structure has not been excavated. The political and logistical complexities of digging at an Egyptian royal site are significant, and the anomaly might be something other than what Herodotus described. The world's most famous ancient traveler wrote his most extraordinary description of a building that may be right where he said it was, and nobody has dug it up. Story 8, Mohenjo-Daro, was one of the largest cities in the ancient world at its peak around 2500 BC, a carefully planned urban settlement in what is now Pakistan's Sindh province, with standardized brick construction, an advanced drainage and sanitation system, a citadel complex, public baths, and residential areas laid out on a grid, all suggesting a level of civic organization and engineering sophistication contemporary with the Egyptian Old Kingdom and Mesopotamian city-states. At its height, it housed somewhere between 20,000 and 50,000 people. By 1900 BC, it was empty. The mystery isn't simply that it was abandoned. Cities have been abandoned throughout history for reasons ranging from resource depletion to military defeat to catastrophic flooding. The mystery of Mohenjo-Daro is that the usual explanations don't fit cleanly, and the Indus Valley Civilization's writing system, which presumably contains the answers, has never been deciphered. The city shows no evidence of military conquest. There are no weapons caches, no burning destruction layers, no bodies disposed in patterns consistent with massacre or rushed burial under military assault. Whatever drove the population out was not an invading army. Climate change, river course change, epidemic disease, and gradual economic decline have all been proposed. Each has some supporting evidence, and each faces objections from specific aspects of the archaeological record. The people who lived in Mohenjo-Daro and who could have answered these questions in their writing left behind thousands of inscribed seals. The Indus script on those seals, despite being one of the most studied, undeciphered writing systems in the world, has not been read. We have their words. We cannot understand them. Whatever they wrote down about their city, their gods, their rulers, and what was happening to their world is locked inside symbols nobody has cracked. Story 9, Sangsing-Dui, a 3,000-year-old Chinese civilization that made objects unlike anything else in Chinese history in 1986. Construction workers digging irrigation ditches in Sichuan province, China, broke into two pits containing one of the most extraordinary Bronze Age hoards ever found. Enormous bronze masks with protruding eyes on stalks. A bronze tree nearly 4 meters tall with birds perched on its branches. Gold scepters, elephant tusks, jade objects, and figurines of humans with physical features unlike anything in the documented Bronze Age Chinese artistic tradition. More pits, discovered from 2020 onward, have added thousands of additional objects. The culture that made them is called Sangsing-Dui, and almost nothing is known about who they were. The specific disorientation the Sangsing-Dui objects create comes from their combination of technical sophistication and complete aesthetic isolation. The bronze casting technique is advanced. These are complex, large-scale castings requiring serious metallurgical knowledge, but the iconographic content, the specific faces and forms and objects produced, have no antecedents in the Yellow River civilizations that are the primary story of Chinese Bronze Age culture, and no clear successors in subsequent Chinese art. They appear to represent an entirely separate cultural tradition, making objects that nobody else was making, and then disappear from the archaeological record around 1000 BCE. The Sangsing-Dui culture left no texts. The abandonment of their sites appears to have involved the deliberate burial and burning of large quantities of bronze and gold objects, which has been interpreted as either ritual deposition, flight from some catastrophe that required leaving valuables behind, or some transitional ceremony whose meaning is lost. What the enormous staring masks represented, what rituals they were used in, what the bronze tree meant, And what happened to the people who made these things are questions with no current answers. Story 10, the Cucuteni Tripilia culture flourished in what is now Romania, Moldova, and Ukraine from approximately 5500 to 2750 BCE, making them one of the largest and longest-lasting prehistoric European cultures. At their peak, they built what are among the largest settlements in Neolithic Europe, proto-cities of several thousand people with planned streets and two-story structures. And every 60 to 80 years, they burned the entire settlement to the ground, deliberately, starting over somewhere else. This isn't interpretation, it's archaeology. The burned settlement layers are a defining stratigraphic feature of Cucuteni Tripilia sites, consistent enough across the culture's enormous geographic range and multi-millennium time span that it's recognized as a systematic practice rather than a series of accidental fires or isolated incidents. The fires were set intentionally, burned everything, and the culture subsequently rebuilt nearby or in a new location. Why they did this is genuinely, thoroughly unknown. The theories that have been seriously proposed in the archaeological literature include ritual purification or renewal of the settlement space, burial practice for a community structure that served as a kind of collective tomb, periodic ecological necessity related to soil exhaustion that required abandoning and resetting agricultural land, and some kind of calendrical or cosmological requirement that the culture's belief system imposed on their relationship to built space. None of these theories is supported by text. The Cucuteni Tripilia culture had no writing, and none is conclusively demonstrated by material evidence in a way that has produced scholarly consensus. The practice continued for 2,000 years across a culture spanning hundreds of kilometers. Whatever their reason was, it was compelling enough that generation after generation of people built cities and then burned them. Story 11, the Tarim mummies. Caucasian-looking people found 3,000 years old in the Chinese desert beginning in the 1990s. Excavations of Bronze Age cemeteries in the Tarim Basin of western China, a harsh desert region that had preserved organic material unusually well, produced something that immediately generated intense scholarly debate. Mummies of people who, based on physical features and the material culture buried with them, appeared to be of European or Western Eurasian rather than East Asian ancestry. They were tall, had light hair, and were buried in woolen tartans and felt clothing of a type more consistent with ancient European textile traditions than with anything documented in Bronze Age China. The Tarim mummy's presence in a location thousands of kilometers from any population with matching cultural characteristics raised immediate and still contested questions about prehistoric human migration. Who were these people? Where did they come from? How did they get to the Tarim Basin? What was their relationship to the surrounding populations? Genetic analysis has progressively refined, but not fully resolved the answer. The most widely supported current interpretation, based on ancient DNA studies published in the early 2020s, is that the Tarim Basin mummies were descended from a population that split off from other Eurasian populations very early. Ancient North Eurasians who had been largely isolated from both East and West for thousands of years before appearing in the Tarim Basin with their distinctive material culture. This makes them not migrants from Europe, but representatives of a third, very old lineage that developed independently. What this ancient population's culture was, what language they spoke, what happened to their descendants, and why they vanished from the archaeological record, while leaving behind mummies so well preserved that their faces are still visible after 3 millennia, are questions that genetic analysis answers partially and archaeological evidence answers incompletely. Story 12, the tomb of Genghis Khan. Hidden so completely that soldiers were killed to preserve the secret when Genghis Khan died in 1227. His death was itself kept secret for long enough to allow his funeral cortege to travel from wherever he died. The location of his death is itself disputed, to his homeland in Mongolia for burial. According to accounts compiled in the decades after his death, The soldiers escorting the body killed everyone they encountered along the route to prevent any witness from being able to describe what they saw or where they were going. After the burial, the soldiers who performed the burial rites were killed by other soldiers, who were then themselves killed. A river was reportedly diverted over the gravesite. Trees were planted. Horses were driven back and forth until the ground showed no sign of disturbance. This is, if the accounts are accurate, a deliberate and extremely thorough erasure of information, and one that has succeeded. Nearly 800 years later, despite significant modern search efforts using satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and DNA analysis of populations living in the regions where the tomb is most likely to be, no confirmed identification of Genghis Khan's burial site has been made. The search is further complicated by the specific geography of Mongolia and the nomadic culture's relationship to land. The Mongol approach to burial was intentionally impermanent, designed to leave no architectural trace, which contrasts sharply with the Egyptian or Chinese approach to royal interment. There is no pyramid to find. There may be nothing visible at the surface at all, even directly above the burial. The Mongolian government has additionally restricted some search activities in areas considered sacred or culturally sensitive, which is a legitimate sovereign decision about cultural heritage that happens to further protect a secret that may have been so well kept it can never be found. Story 13: The Copper Scroll Treasure. A real metal scroll listing 64 hiding places for gold that nobody has found. The Dead Sea Scrolls are primarily written on leather or papyrus. One of them is different: rolled sheets of copper, inscribed with text that, when unrolled and deciphered, proved to be a list of hiding places for an enormous quantity of gold, silver, and other treasures. The Copper Scroll, discovered in Cave 3 at Qumran in 1952, lists 64 separate locations where quantities of precious metals were buried or concealed, with enough geographic detail to suggest the list was meant to be actionable. Someone was supposed to be able to find these places. The total quantity of treasure described in the scroll is staggering even by conservative estimates. Calculations of the amounts listed in the Hebrew text produce figures in the range of 26 to 65 tons of silver and gold combined, depending on how the units are interpreted. This is either the hiding record of some known historical treasury. The temple in Jerusalem has been proposed, as has the treasury of a messianic movement, or it's a piece of wishful fiction, or a religious document whose quantities are symbolic rather than literal. The locations described use ancient place names and geographic references that haven't been conclusively matched to modern locations. Dozens of serious search expeditions and scholarly investigations have attempted to identify and excavate the described sites. None has produced a confirmed discovery of any of the 64 listed treasures. Whether the scroll describes real, physically existing hidden gold, a displaced treasury from the temple that was deliberately dispersed to prevent Roman seizure, or something more symbolic, has been debated without resolution since the text was first published. The scroll is real. The treasure, if it ever existed in the form described, has not been found in 70 years of looking. Story 14: The Lost Army of Cambyses. 50,000 Persian soldiers who marched into the desert and never came back in 525 BCE. The Persian king Cambyses II sent an army of approximately 50,000 soldiers from Thebes into the Egyptian western desert, heading toward the Siwa oasis with the stated goal of conquering or destroying the oracle of a moon there. According to the account preserved by Herodotus, the army never arrived. A catastrophic sandstorm, described as burying the entire force under the desert, was the explanation Herodotus recorded from Egyptian sources. Not a man returned. No subsequent account adds anything reliable. The complete disappearance of 50,000 people is an extraordinary claim, and the historical record's total silence after the army's departure has been taken two ways: as evidence that the disaster really was total and catastrophic, leaving no survivors to give account, or as evidence that the story as told is exaggerated, and that a smaller force met some more ordinary military or logistical fate that got inflated in the retelling. In 2009, 2 Italian archaeologists announced that they had found evidence of the army in the western desert near the Siwa oasis, metal weapons, jewelry, and human bones that they associated with a Persian military force from the relevant period. Their find generated significant media attention. It also generated significant scholarly skepticism. The evidence they described was not published through peer-reviewed channels in a form that allowed independent verification, and subsequent excavations in the area have not confirmed the discovery to the satisfaction of the Egyptological community. The question of whether 50,000 men are buried somewhere in the Egyptian Western Desert, or whether they died in smaller numbers and less dramatic circumstances, or whether the story is substantially embellished, remains open. Story 15: Yamashita's Gold. Billions in Maui loot that may be booby-trapped somewhere in the Philippines. The Yamashita treasure theory holds that during the Japanese occupation of Southeast Asia in World War II, enormous quantities of looted gold, currency, jewelry, and other valuables, plundered from banks, museums, and private collections across China, the Philippines, and other occupied territories, were shipped to the Philippines and hidden in underground tunnels, bunkers, and cave systems by Japanese forces under General Tomoyuki Yamashita, who commanded Japanese forces in the Philippines during the war's final phase. The historical basis for the claim is real. Japanese forces did systematically loot occupied Asian countries, and gold reserves and museum collections were among the most documented targets of this looting. That significant quantities of this material moved through the Philippines during and before the American Reconquest is not disputed. What is disputed is whether it was hidden in the form and quantity the treasure theory describes, and whether any meaningful portion of it remains hidden. A 1988 Philippine court case produced a decision in favor of treasure hunter Rogelio Roxas against Ferdinand Marcos, awarding damages for Marcos's alleged theft of gold Roxas claimed to have discovered. Legal proceedings that treated the treasure's existence as sufficiently credible to adjudicate over. Marcos's own finances have been the subject of investigation that some researchers believe reflects undisclosed recovered treasure. The booby trap element is the dimension that makes active searching dangerous beyond normal treasure hunting risk. Reports describe tunnel systems designed with built-in collapse mechanisms, false floors over shafts, and in some accounts, chemical traps. Several individuals who have pursued Yamashita treasure claims have died or disappeared in circumstances consistent with these risks. Whether the gold exists in the quantities described, where it is, and what condition the tunnels are in, are all genuinely unresolved. Story 16: The Gurab Ship Cart. A 3,000-year-old Egyptian tomb contained a model of a Greek ship on wheels. Among the artifacts recovered from Gurab, an Egyptian settlement dating to the New Kingdom period around 1200 BC, is a small wooden model that immediately strikes anyone who sees it as strange, a recognizably Greek Mycenaean warship. Built with the distinctive features of late Bronze Age Aegean vessel design, mounted on top of a wheeled cart. Not a boat, not a cart. A boat on a cart, in a form specific enough that maritime historians can identify the vessel type, and land transport historians can identify the wheel and axle arrangement. Egypt in 1200 BC had extensive contact with the Mycenaean Greek world. Archaeological evidence from this period includes Mycenaean pottery at Egyptian sites, Egyptian objects at Greek sites, and textual references to the Aegean in Egyptian administrative records. The presence of some Greek cultural artifact at an Egyptian site is not itself puzzling. What's puzzling is why the specific combination of a seagoing vessel mounted on a wheeled land transport would be meaningful enough to someone to create a model of it and include it in a funerary or ritual context. The theories that have been seriously proposed include a model of a ship being transported overland between waterways, a ceremonial or religious object whose meaning is lost, a toy or decorative object for a child of mixed cultural background, or a record of some specific historical event, perhaps a ship dragged across land, that was considered worth memorializing. None of these explanations has achieved consensus. The object is in the Petrie Museum at University College London. where it has been studied for over a century without producing a settled interpretation of why it exists in the form it does. Story 17, the Sajama Lines. 15 times the size of the Nazca Lines, and somehow even less explained everyone knows about the Nazca Lines in Peru. The massive geoglyphs visible only from the air, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, the subject of decades of documentary attention and speculation. Almost nobody knows about the Sajama Lines in Bolivia, which cover 15 times the area of the Nazca complex, are estimated to be among the oldest and most extensive earthwork systems in the world, and have received a fraction of the scholarly or public attention their scale would seem to warrant. The Sajama Lines are a network of perfectly straight pathways etched into the volcanic soils and altiplano of the Bolivian Andes near the Sajama volcano, covering approximately 22,000 square kilometers. The lines are straight to a degree that requires coordinated surveying across distances of up to 3 kilometers between sightlines, not something that can be accomplished by accident or by a single individual working without reference points across the scale of the landscape involved. The culture that created them over roughly 3,000 years of construction left no writing, and the descendants of the people who made them, Aymara-speaking communities who still live in the region, have oral traditions that connect the paths to ancestor veneration and ritual travel between sacred sites. Particularly ceremonial structures called chulpas and churches in the communities through which the paths run. Whether this oral tradition accurately preserves the original purpose of lines constructed thousands of years before the communities currently living along them arrived is impossible to verify archaeologically. The spatial relationship between the lines and the sacred sites they connect is suggestive, but doesn't explain the extraordinary engineering effort to make the paths perfectly straight across such distances, or why that straightness specifically was valued. Story 18, the Codex Gigas, a 165-pound medieval book with a full-page portrait of the devil. Origin unknown. The Codex Gigas, the giant book, is the largest medieval manuscript in the world, measuring approximately 92 centimeters tall, 50 centimeters wide, and 22 centimeters thick, weighing approximately 75 kilograms. It requires 2 people to lift. It contains the entire Latin Bible, several encyclopedic works including a complete copy of Josephus's Antiquities of the Jews and Isidore of Seville's Etymologiae, medical texts, and various other content. It was created in Bohemia sometime in the early 13th century. On one page, filling an entire 50 by 92 centimeter folio, is a full-page illustration of the devil, a green-skinned figure with red claws, cloven hooves, animal ears, and an isolated position against the parchment that is notably different from any other illustration in the manuscript, and unlike any other known medieval illustration of the devil in size, isolation, and compositional treatment. The legend that grew up around this image is that a monk at the Padles Monastery was sentenced to death for violating monastic rules, and negotiated his way out of execution by promising to create a single manuscript containing all human knowledge in a single night. Reaching midnight with the task impossible, he made a pact with the devil, who completed the manuscript in exchange for the monk's soul and his own portrait in the book. What's actually unknown is considerably more mundane, but no less puzzling. The author of the manuscript has never been identified. The manuscript's own introductory materials don't name the scribe. Paleographic analysis suggests a single person's handwriting throughout the entire enormous document, a production timeline that would require about 20 years of sustained daily work, but whose handwriting it is and what monk or scholar spent decades creating it is an archival blank. Story 19, the Yonaguni Monument, a massive underwater structure that nobody can agree is man-made off the coast of Yonaguni-jima, Japan's westernmost island. At a depth of 5 to 40 meters below the Pacific surface lies a massive stone formation, approximately 250 meters long, 25 meters high, and composed of flat terraces, sharp right-angle edges, carved-looking steps, and geometric features that, in underwater photographs, looks less like a natural rock formation and more like the ruins of something built. This is the Yonaguni Monument, discovered by a diving instructor in 1986, and the subject of genuinely unresolved scientific debate about whether it is natural or artificial. The case for natural formation relies on the specific geology of the region. The Yonaguni Monument is composed of fine-grained mudstone and sandstone that naturally fractures along horizontal and vertical planes due to its crystal structure, and the ocean currents of the area have thousands of years of erosive force to work with. Natural rock formations with flat terraces, right angles, and step-like features do exist elsewhere in the world. Geologist Robert Schoch, who has studied the site extensively, considers the formation primarily natural in origin. The case for artificial origin focuses on specific features that are harder to attribute to natural fracturing, what appears to be a carved pathway running between two sections, a triangular pool-like depression with right-angle corners, and a double-headed human face carving on one rock face that has been analyzed by archaeologists who find it too regular to be coincidental. Masaki Kimura, a marine geologist at the University of the Ryukyus who has dived the site more than 100 times, argues for man-made or man-modified origin. If the structure is partly artificial, it would have been built at a time when the land was above sea level, which the regional geological record places at between 8,000 and 10,000 years ago. Story 20 Teotihuacan, the sixth largest city of the ancient world, left no name, no rulers, no language at its peak around 450 say. Teotihuacan in the Valley of Mexico housed somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 people, making it one of the largest cities on Earth at the time, and larger than any contemporary European city. It had a carefully planned grid layout extending over 20 square kilometers, monumental architecture including the massive Pyramid of the Sun and Pyramid of the Moon, multi-family apartment compounds housing its population, craft production workshops, and extensive trade networks reaching across Mesoamerica. It was, in any meaningful sense, an urban civilization. It left no text we can read. The Teotihuacan writing system, believed to have existed based on glyphic elements found in murals and on ceramics, has not been deciphered, if it was a full writing system rather than a limited notational one. No confirmed ruler's name, no founding account, no religious text in any readable form has survived. The city's murals depict deities, rituals, and what may be narrative scenes. But without accompanying readable text, their specific content is interpreted rather than read. We don't know what language the inhabitants spoke. We don't know what they called themselves, their city, or their gods. We don't know whether they had a king, a council, or some other political structure. Notably, unlike every other major Mesoamerican city, Teotihuacan's art contains no depictions of individual rulers, which is either evidence of a non-royal political system or evidence that portraits existed but haven't been found. Even the name Teotihuacan is a Nahuatl word meaning roughly place where the gods were made, given by the Aztecs, who visited the ruins centuries after the city's decline and had no reliable information about who had built it. Story 21 Dorinkuyu, an underground city for 20,000 people built against a threat nobody remembers beneath the town of Dorinkuyu, in Turkey's Cappadocia region. Carved into the soft volcanic tuff of the Anatolian Plateau, is a multi-level underground city extending approximately 85 meters below the surface, with 18 levels containing stables, wineries, oil presses, wells, communal living areas, kitchens, schools, chapels, and ventilation shafts. At its fullest estimated capacity, the complex could shelter approximately 20,000 people along with their livestock. It is one of approximately 200 such underground complexes known in Cappadocia, of which 40 are connected to each other by underground tunnels. Dorinkuyu's engineering is sophisticated. The ventilation system kept air circulating through all levels. The wells were designed so that water could be accessed from below but blocked from above to prevent poisoning of defenders. And massive millstone doors could be rolled to seal corridor entrances from the inside. This is not a shelter improvised from an existing cave. It is a deliberately engineered city designed for defensive occupation under extended siege conditions. What threat was it designed against? The inhabitants of Cappadocia over the millennia have included Hittites, Phrygians, Persians, Alexander's Greeks, Romans, Byzantines, and eventually the Ottoman Turks, any of whom could theoretically have been the motivation for underground refuge. Byzantine-era Christian symbols found in the lower levels suggest active use during that period. But the excavation of the lowest and presumably oldest levels has not definitively established when the complex was first begun, or what specific threat the original builders were hiding from. The scale of the project, excavating tens of thousands of cubic meters of rock by hand to create living space for 20,000 people, implies a threat severe enough to justify extraordinary collective labor. What that threat was, and for whom specifically the deepest levels were built, remains undetermined. Story 22, Nan Madol, a city built on coral reefs from 750,000 tonnes of magnetized stone on the eastern coast of Pohnpei in Micronesia. In a lagoon separated from the main island by a narrow channel, stand the ruins of Nan Madol, a city built on 92 artificial islands constructed from basalt columns and coral, connected by a network of channels and enclosed by massive walls of stacked basalt logs, many of them weighing between 5 and 50 tons. Approximately 750,000 tons of basalt were used in the construction, much of it quarried from a source on the other side of Pohnpei Island, and somehow transported across open water and maneuvered into place in a lagoon. The basalt columns used in Nan Madol are naturally occurring. The geological formations of Pohnpei produce the characteristic hexagonal basalt prisms that form the city's walls, but naturally occurring basalt logs don't move themselves. The specific mystery is the logistics. A Pohnpeian population that at its peak might have numbered in the tens of thousands somehow transported enormous stone columns across water, placed them in precise stacks without mortar to form stable walls and foundations, and constructed a city on an artificial island platform in a tidal lagoon. The methods used remain unknown. The city was the seat of the Saudeleur dynasty, who ruled Pohnpei for several centuries before being overthrown around 1500 C. After the dynasty's fall, Nan Madol was abandoned and became an object of Pohnpeian oral tradition associated with powerful magic and dangerous spirits, accounts that include folk memories of the city's construction by twin sorcerers who flew the stones into place using magic. The magnetic anomalies in the basalt columns, which are noted in this entry's description, are real. The basalt has distinctive magnetic properties that some researchers have proposed may have been a factor in the site's selection or ritual significance, though this remains speculative. Story 23, Great Zimbabwe, a medieval African city whose history was actively destroyed by colonial authorities. Great Zimbabwe is a complex of dry stone enclosures, towers, and walls spread across approximately 7 square kilometers in what is now Zimbabwe. Constructed primarily between the 11th and 15th centuries, say, and representing at its peak the political and economic center of a Shona state controlling trade routes between the African interior and the Swahili coast ports. It is the largest ancient stone structure in sub-Saharan Africa, south of the Nile. The specific intellectual crime committed at Great Zimbabwe is documented, and its consequences are ongoing. When European settlers colonized the region in the late 19th century, they encountered a local African oral tradition that attributed the construction to Shona ancestors, and archaeological evidence consistent with precisely that attribution. The colonial authorities and the privately funded organization responsible for early archaeological work at the site systematically suppressed, dismissed, and in some cases physically destroyed evidence supporting African construction. Actively promoted alternative theories attributing the site to Phoenicians, Egyptians, Arabs, or any non-African origin, and fired archaeologists who insisted on the African-built conclusion. Archaeologists Richard Hall, in his capacity as curator of the site in the early 20th century, removed entire stratigraphic layers in his efforts to find evidence of foreign origin. destroying the archaeological context that would have allowed subsequent researchers to answer detailed questions about the site's construction timeline, population, and specific cultural practices. The African construction has been archaeologically confirmed for decades and is the scholarly and historical consensus. But the irreplaceable stratigraphic data that Hall and others destroyed cannot be recovered, which means specific questions about when exactly particular structures were built, how the population was organized, and what economic practices sustained the city are permanently unanswerable because the evidence was deliberately removed to serve a political agenda. Story 24: The Desert Kites. 9,000-year-old animal traps only visible from the air, scattered across the deserts and semi-arid regions of the Middle East. Jordan, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Armenia are thousands of stone wall structures that, viewed from above, form a recognizable pattern. Two long walls angling inward toward a central enclosure, like a funnel, or more specifically, like the shape of a kite. Some kite systems extend for several kilometers. Some enclosures have pits dug inside them. The structures date from approximately 9,000 years ago and appear to have been used continuously and expanded over many millennia. The leading archaeological interpretation is that the kites were animal traps. The long walls served as guidelines that herding animals or hunters could use to funnel migrating gazelle and other prey into the enclosure, where the animals could be killed efficiently in large numbers. This interpretation is supported by the structural logic of the walls and the pits inside the enclosures, and by the fact that the kites appear to align with known animal migration routes in the regions where they occur. But the scale challenges simple interpretation. A kite with walls extending 3 or 4 kilometers was not built in a season, and it was not built by one family or small group. Coordinating the labor to build these structures across the landscape over timescales measured in centuries implies social and organizational capacity in Stone Age societies that the conventional picture of pre-agricultural human organization doesn't obviously accommodate. These were communities complex enough to plan and execute multi-generational engineering projects serving collective purposes. The structures are invisible from the ground. You cannot see their shape or understand what they are until you are high enough above them. Whether the builders knew their own work was only legible from an altitude they could never achieve, and whether this was intentional or an emergent property of solving a logistical problem, is unknowable. Story 25: The Pictish Beast. An animal carved on hundreds of stones across Scotland that has never been identified. The Picts were a people of northern and eastern Scotland, known from Roman accounts and from their own remarkable carved standing stones, who dominated the region from approximately the 3rd to the 9th century CE, before being absorbed into the emerging Kingdom of Scotland. Their stones are carved with geometric symbols, animals, and hunting scenes of great artistic sophistication, and they left behind no text in any language anyone can read. Among the animal carvings, one specific creature appears on more Pictish stones than any other. A sinuous, long-snouted animal with curled flippers or feet, a distinctive curled tail, and a specific posture that appears consistently across hundreds of stones from across Pictish territory. This creature is called the Pictish Beast, or sometimes the swimming elephant, or the hippocampus, by researchers who have attempted to identify it. None of those identifications has achieved consensus. The consistency of the depiction is what makes it specifically puzzling. Across hundreds of stones separated by large distances, and apparently produced by different sculptors over several centuries, the creature is depicted with enough specific, consistent detail to make it clear that a definite subject is being represented. This is not artistic variation on a general animal theme, but a specific, agreed-upon, iconographic object. But the creature doesn't match any animal known to have lived in Scotland, doesn't match any sea creature from the known Pictish coastal environment, and doesn't match any known mythological creature from any adjacent cultural tradition. Whether the Pictish beast represents a real animal the Picts knew that modern zoology doesn't account for, a mythological being specific to Pictish belief, a symbol or heraldic device whose meaning was conventional within Pictish culture, or something else entirely? Nobody knows. 8 centuries of stones have been carved with it, and not one surviving inscription explains it. Story 26: The Etruscans. The people who shaped Rome left behind a language nobody else speaks. The Etruscan civilization dominated central Italy from approximately the 8th century to the 3rd century BC, developing the urban culture, religious practices, architectural traditions, and artistic conventions that Rome would later absorb and transmit to the world. The Roman alphabet is derived from the Etruscan alphabet. Roman gladiatorial games, religious augury, the toga, the atrium house plan, the triumph ceremony, and many other foundational elements of Roman culture are Etruscan inheritances. Rome was, for much of its early history, partly an Etruscan city. The Etruscan language is not related to Latin, not related to any other Italic language, not related to any Indo-European language family. It belongs to no known language family at all. Several thousand Etruscan inscriptions survive, mostly short dedications and tomb inscriptions. And because the Etruscans used a derived form of the Greek alphabet, these inscriptions can be read aloud without knowing what the words mean. The problem is meaning rather than script. Most of the vocabulary is guessed from context rather than confirmed from bilingual texts. The one significant bilingual text, the Pyrgi tablets, provides some Etruscan and Phoenician in parallel, but the tablets are short and the parallel isn't close enough to provide more than limited vocabulary confirmation. The Liber Linteus, linen wrappings from an Egyptian mummy, contains the longest surviving Etruscan text, approximately 1,200 words, which has been partially understood as a religious calendar but not fully translated. Where the Etruscans came from, whether they were indigenous to Italy or migrants from Anatolia, as ancient authors claimed, has been partially addressed by recent ancient Dina analysis, which suggests a complex mixture of European and Anatolian ancestry that doesn't cleanly resolve the question. Their language's isolation remains absolute. Story 27: Linear A. The writing system that predates Greek Linear B and has never been cracked. Linear B, the syllabic writing system used by Mycenaean Greek Bronze Age administrators, was deciphered in 1952 by Michael Ventris, who demonstrated that it represented an early form of Greek. The decipherment was one of the great intellectual achievements of 20th century scholarship, and it opened up a substantial corpus of Mycenaean administrative records, grain inventories, livestock counts, personnel lists that had been sealed in clay for 3,000 years. Linear A is the writing system that preceded Linear B, and from which B was clearly derived. The sign forms are obviously related. Many signs appear in both scripts, and the two systems share structural features that make their genetic relationship unmistakable. Linear A was used by the Minoan civilization of Bronze Age Crete, a seafaring culture that dominated the Aegean before the Mycenaean Greeks rose to prominence. The Minoans produced some of the most extraordinary art of the ancient world, constructed the palace complex at Knossos, and left behind hundreds of Linear A inscriptions on clay tablets. Linear A has not been deciphered. Applying the Mycenaean Greek values of the shared Linear B signs to Linear A produces sounds. The signs can be read aloud, in a sense, but the words produced don't correspond to any known language. The underlying language of Linear A is not Greek, not Semitic, not related to any identified language family with enough surviving material to provide comparative data for decipherment. The Minoan language died with its speakers, absorbed by the Greek-speaking culture that replaced them after around 1450 BC. Without a bilingual text or a closely related known language to use as a key, decipherment may be permanently out of reach. The signs can be pronounced. The words are still silent. Story 28: The Antikythera Mechanism. A 2,000-year-old computer that shouldn't have been possible in 1901. Sponge divers working off the Greek island of Antikythera recovered from a Roman-era shipwreck a corroded lump of bronze that turned out to be one of the most important objects in the history of human technology. a mechanical device of extraordinary complexity. Using at least 30 interlocking bronze gears to track and predict astronomical phenomena, including solar and lunar eclipses, the positions of the sun and moon, the 4-year Olympiad cycle, and what appears to be the positions of the 5 planets known to antiquity. The Antikythera mechanism was built sometime between 150 and 100 BCE. The equivalent mechanical complexity, gear trains of this sophistication, with this number of components working in coordination to perform astronomical calculations, does not reappear in the archaeological or historical record for approximately 1,000 years after its creation. Medieval European astronomical clocks of the 13th and 14th centuries C are the first comparable devices, and they are clearly independent inventions rather than inheritors of a continuous tradition. This gap is what the mystery is. We know the Antikythera mechanism existed. We know it worked. We know it was sophisticated enough that its full capabilities are still being worked out by modern researchers using X-ray tomography and computational modeling. What we don't know is who made it, in what workshop tradition, building on what accumulated knowledge of mechanical construction and astronomical calculation, and why the tradition that produced it apparently disappeared so completely that 1,000 years passed before comparable devices were made again. The most commonly accepted answer, that this was an isolated peak of Hellenistic craftsmanship, whose practitioners died or stopped transmitting their knowledge, and whose surviving artifacts were not widely known, is probably correct but ultimately unsatisfying, because it names the gap without explaining it. Story 29, the School and Kafse Wave. Modern humans left Africa 100,000 years early. Then vanished the standard narrative of modern human dispersal out of Africa. The migration that eventually populated the entire world places the successful out-of-Africa wave at approximately 50,000 to 60,000 years ago. The genetic and archaeological evidence for this is strong. The ancestors of all non-African people alive today appear to derive from a population that left Africa roughly at this time. The School and Kafse cave sites in northern Israel complicate this picture in a way that has not been fully explained. The caves contain human skeletons that are anatomically modern, unmistakably Homo sapiens, buried alongside personal ornaments of marine shells and with deliberately applied ochre pigment, dating to approximately 90,000 to 120,000 years ago. These are modern humans, outside Africa, exhibiting symbolic behavior 50,000 years before the ancestors of all living non-Africans made the same journey. They didn't survive. Whatever population these individuals belonged to, an early, successful dispersal from Africa that reached the Levant and may have gone further, left no detectable genetic trace in any living human population. They appear to have gone extinct, absorbed by later populations, or returned to Africa at some point, without contributing meaningfully to the genetic heritage of the modern humans who subsequently colonized the world. Why this early wave failed, while the later wave succeeded, is genuinely unknown. Climate change that reduced available habitat, competition with Neanderthal populations that occupied the same region, epidemic disease, or simple bad luck in small founding populations are all proposed explanations. The early migrants were anatomically and apparently behaviorally modern. What they lacked that their successors had, or what the world lacked that it later developed, is one of the deepest open questions in human prehistory.